Mr. Chief of the General Staff of the Armies, Mr. Nuncio, my lord, ladies and gentlemen ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen directors, ladies and gentlemen in your ranks and qualities, dear friends. I am pleased to welcome you once again to the Élysée Palace on the occasion of the 30th Conference of Ambassadors. Of course, I would like to thank you for the work done this year, to thank the Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs, the Deputy Ministers, the Secretary General, the Directors, the agents of the Crisis and Support Center, all the agents wherever they serve, in Paris, Nantes or abroad. I also want, of course, to thank our military, our civil servants from all other ministries, who also each serve our country, in their role everywhere abroad. I know your efforts at the direct service of our compatriots, and your commitment to the promotion of our interests, our ideas, our values, with the assistance of all operators on the ground. And I also have a thought, and a lot of gratitude, for all those who are France in the eyes of the world and contribute to its reputation, its attractiveness, its prestige, starting with the French abroad in the diversity of their talents, to all their consular and parliamentary elected officials. And I am also thinking of humanitarian workers, volunteers, entrepreneurs, creators, journalists, researchers, and so many others. We meet again in January and not in September, because you were mobilized for the Olympic and Paralympic Games, which were a popular, sporting, and organizational success. A diplomatic success also insofar as France shone and offered a radiant face to the rest of the world. And I thank you for the contribution that here too has been made to the benefit of this great sporting event for the country and beyond. And to meet you again in January is obviously above all an opportunity for me to present to you my sincere wishes for you, your families who, I know, contribute so much to the mission that is yours, and to all the teams who, with you, serve the country. All my best wishes for the coming year. So, I had the opportunity to tell the French on the evening of December 31st, we are at the turn of the quarter of a century. And this one opens a period that was not necessarily the one we were waiting for. And while we were written in the year 2000 a history that was all traced, the conquering democracy, the end of conflicts, lucidity must lead us to see that a quarter of a century later, this is not quite what we are living. And so yes, you serve France and its interests in the mess of the world, with a particular requirement that goes with the diplomatic profession for yourself and your loved ones and all your teams. And that is why, in saying it, I am saying it to women and men who know the requirement of this mission, and the reality of what this word disorder means. And I want to express a very special gratitude to our agents in Kiev, in Beirut, in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, in Bamako, Ouagadougou, in Port-au-Prince, Port Vila in Caracas, and everywhere where it has been necessary every day in recent months. To show courage in action and to serve the country was particularly dangerous. This courage is needed in the chaos of the world, indeed, given all these disorders. And it must be said, 25 years later, we are waking up in a world, and I would even say simply 10 years later, where what seemed unthinkable is happening. Disorder born from the weakening of international rules, challenged by other powers who no longer play the game, are deploying without complex in new spaces of international confrontation, and are trying to fragment the world to their advantage. 10 years ago, and I salute here the mobilization of French diplomacy and the minister who led it at the time, we concluded a historic agreement, the Paris Climate Agreements. Who could imagine it today? Disorders of democracies threatened by the questioning of their promise of prosperity, social ascension, sharing of progress, and directly attacked by destabilizing powers. Just a few weeks ago, Romania had to cancel a presidential election due to interference and electoral manipulation clearly attributed to Russia. Who would have imagined it just 10 years ago? France has itself been attacked by unacceptable interference in most of these ultramarine territories, and especially in New Caledonia in recent months by Azerbaijan, which thought it would settle its own misunderstandings there. Because we defend international law, and Armenia, who would have imagined it? 10 years ago, if we had been told that the owner of one of the largest social networks in the world would support a new reactionary international and intervene directly in the elections, including in Germany, who would have imagined it? This is the world in which we live and in which we are dealing with diplomacy. Disorder, also technological revolutions that upset our habits, our lifestyles, our very conceptions of history, disorder, in which states threaten to be overtaken by the power and the striking force of private companies, but orders in chiaroscuro. Because these technological innovations also resolutely carry innovations, transformations of our lives for the better, and firm space to biology, evolutions that will allow us to do better. Finally, there are global challenges, global warming, of which everyone measures the consequences of Spain in Mayotte every day. A new pandemic, inequalities that are not being reduced enough, development divergences on which all the promoters of unrest, drug traffickers, migrant smugglers, terrorists thrive. Basically, this world that I am describing, and I have had the opportunity to do so in recent years, but unfortunately, it is taking an increasingly clear turn, is marked by the return of imperial impulses, the upheavals of information and knowledge, and the very violent questioning of humanism. And so it is basically a triple strategic, technological, and political philosophical disruption. And this period is somewhat reminiscent of the Renaissance. And the question is simple. In this Renaissance, which are the nations that are doing well? Those who obey the rules of the world before, or those who understood that we needed a realism that knows how to keep its ideals? And basically, we need both moral strength, but also strength in short. And we have to get out in many ways and on many subjects of a form of naivety, or in any case of use, that continues to take place in our practices. I had the opportunity to say it a few months ago, using the metaphor of herbivores and carnivores, but here we are. Those who will continue to apply rules that the other great powers no longer apply will have the privilege of being devoured. However, deciding to be strong is only valid if it is to serve the values that are ours and the principles to which we subscribe, which fundamentally differentiates us from these authoritarian forces that are returning. So, this exit from innocence must not go without voluntarism. And for the past 7 years, I have always kept this language of truth, whatever it costs me, about the refusal of a European weakening, the transformations of our transatlantic link, the gravity of our system to apprehend the world, and the need to read the world as it is and things as they are. Therefore, when I speak to you today, I am well aware that I am probably doing so in front of high-ranking diplomats, who are asking themselves sincere questions, and also at a time when our compatriots are asking themselves very sincere questions. It is enough to read the press to finally say to yourself, everything is over. It's all over. Democracies, it was an ideal of yesterday. Everyone seems to be fascinated by a new order that is coming, and that is shaking up all the rules. And somehow, we would almost end up wondering if it is necessary to fight. I believe quite the opposite. Yes, it's worth it, and we have some weapons. First, the first question that many people ask themselves, which we sometimes ask ourselves reading the chronicles, and the prevailing spirit of defeat, does France still have the means for its policy? Yes, quite simply. The Constitution is solid and clear, our choices are just as clear, and the assets that are ours remain. The French assets have not disappeared. Our diplomatic strength, our presence on all oceans, the influence of our language. We saw it again during the last summit of the Francophonie, that France had the honor of hosting. These are strengths. The power of our culture is there. It was enough to see the whole come to the bedside of Notre Dame de Paris rebuilt. And France's ability to hold major events, as we showed at the Olympic and Paralympic Games, is there. It is simply necessary that all French people, all French women, have the lucidity of the rest of the world about ourselves. We have this capacity, it is there, and this base of history, values, culture is very present, just as much as our academic, technological and industrial research strength. In recent years, we have also strengthened our assets, made significant efforts by the nation to strengthen our diplomatic and military presence. And I know the Prime Minister's willingness to continue this one and to commit resolutely to this path. Investment in our diplomacy. I hear all the defenders of France who would be fading away, collapsing. Why didn't they, when they were in business, defend a budget at least up to the one you have today? We are not at a time of decreasing investments in the diplomatic network. For the past 7 years, we have invested in diplomacy, raised the ministry's budget. The number of jobs, as I mentioned last year, are voluntary contributions to international organizations. We have launched a transformation agenda to adapt our resources to the challenges of the times with a real change in methods. An important effort in terms of communication, information, influence, absolutely essential, and that we must continue. And I know that I can count on you in this matter. And I myself came to the ministry in March 2023 to announce all this. The investment is very real, and it is there. Investment in our armies. I will come back to this during my wishes to the armed forces on January 20. At the end of the military programming law, we will have doubled our military budget in 10 years. Which country can say the same? And we didn't wait 2022 to wake up. Solidarity investment too. From 2018 to 2022, our solidarity investments have increased by 50%. 50%. In absolute terms, an increase from 10.3 billion, 0.4 of NI, to 15.1 billion, 0.56 of NI. Which country can we say the same during this period? With this ambition, we have become the 4th largest donor in the OCT. Over the same period, we created 48 French alliances, bringing their number to 835, which from time to time reduced their network, renounced their ambitions. Over the same period, 150,000 additional students were welcomed in the schools of the French education network. There are now 600,000 of them. Which country can say the same? Over the same period, we have given ourselves the means to spread our influence. Through the Site Internationale de la Langue Française in Villers-Cotterêts, in the Site du Développement that we were building in Paris, or in the Maison des Mondes Africains, the foundations of which we will lay in 2025. These are each time investments for the nation in a difficult financial context. We are committed to this, and I thank the Prime Minister and the ministers for continuing with this commitment. And so yes, the country is solid. The international, diplomatic, and military commitment is solid. The second question that I often hear is, does Europe still have the means for its policy? Will Europe be able to move forward? Look, President Trump is coming, it's terrible. First of all, I have to tell you, it's the luck of the experience, no doubt, but several of you have lived it alongside me. It was exactly the same questions 8 years ago. And we were predicted the worst. President-elect Trump, Brexit was here, Europe was screwed. When I look at the last 7 years, we have not lost our way in Europe. France proposed European sovereignty, more independence, strategic autonomy. French nonsense, we were told. It will never happen, do yourself a favor, go ahead, make speeches. This discourse is European today. It is in all European texts, at the heart of the Commission's missions. Victory Graham bitch. European defense, we used to say. French idea, go ahead. There is only NATO, no other way. No one is discussing today the European pillar of NATO and all the instruments that we have put in place over the last 7 years. Joint indebtedness, oh, the dream, the madness. Come on then. 2020, in the middle of COVID, Franco-German agreement, and agreement of the Europeans. For a common indebtedness in the face of it. If we decide to be defeatist, there is no chance of winning. But with clear ideas, a desire to move forward, we have moved our Europe forward resolutely over the last 7 years, and today, it is able to meet the challenges that are its own, and I will come back to that. Because we have also given a new impetus, a new foundation to our relations within this Europe with Germany by the Treaty of Aachen, which has strengthened our bilateral ties by also signing treaties for the new century with Spain and Italy. And we are preparing for the spring a treaty of the same ambition with Poland, which will be signed in Nancy. And by forging a strategic partnership with Greece, we have shown initiative. Europe is both our duty and our chance, and it is this method that must continue. Ambition of the community agenda, a desire to engage bilateral relations everywhere throughout Europe. I visited all the capitals during my first term, and I will do the same during the second, and somehow refuse from a fatigue of it. So let's not give in to the spirit of defeat and this new fatalism. Europe has a place, it is up to us to give it an ambition. And then the third simple question, does the election of President Trump mean even more uncertainty? For the same reasons, I will exercise relative caution. From 2016 to 2020, France has been able to work with President Trump. So, we know what there are disagreements about. The climate issue, the international order. I also note that the first visit abroad of the president-elect was to Paris, Notre Dame, and a strategic discussion has begun. I also know one thing, it is that if we decide to be weak and defeatist, there is little chance of being respected by the United States of America of President Trump. And so, by all means, hello. It is up to us to know how to cooperate with the choice that has been made by the American people. I believe that President Trump knows that he has a solid ally in France, an ally that he does not underestimate, who has clear views, who believes in Europe, who has confidence in him, who carries an ambition for the transatlantic relationship, but a lucid ambition. I will have the opportunity to return to it, looking very clearly at the fact that for 2011 years, successive American presidents have been telling us all the same thing. Their priority is first of all the United States of America, then the relationship with China. Europe has another rank, another place. Let's be lucid enough to see it, and therefore let's work by being coherent. Once I have answered these three environmental questions in substance, and you have understood it, with determination and determination. It is by being clear-eyed about the situation, but by having this desire both to be bold, and to carry clear policies for our compatriots that I want to come back to you here around the three priorities that I assign to us for the coming year. First of all, we have a collective primary mission, to contribute to the security of France and the French. The second is to work for French and European prosperity, which is an existential struggle. I had the opportunity to express myself on this a few months ago at the Sorbonne, but I wanted to come back to it. And the third is the defense of the international order and of our values, which, I believe, contribute at the same time to the defense of our interests and a certain vision of the world. Therefore, contributing to the security of France and the French people is indeed our absolute priority. First of all, in the face of terrorist risks, and I will come back to it with gravity in this week, when we will have to commemorate the 10 years of the attack perpetrated against Charlie Hebdo and the hypercacker, as we will remember in November the attacks in Paris. 10 years. During these 10 years, we have carried the fight against terrorism with a remarkable work that has been done by all the services. The GG, the GEG, the police and gendarmerie services, our magistrates, to counter the threat, to ensure the safety of our fellow citizens. And we have adapted both our legislative arsenal, our organization, and our resources by reinvesting massively thereto. But it is a fight that we have also carried out outside our borders in a very logical way, in the Levant, as in the Saal. And I want to greet here our diplomats as well as our soldiers who have committed themselves throughout this period. Indeed, in the Saal, we have succeeded in preventing the establishment of a territorial caliphate that would have threatened France's interests and its security. And without the French military, the thing was already decided. And we have worked and continue to do so within the framework of the inherent operation Isolde against rising terrorism, with exemplary commitment thereto. But we must, and I want to say it again today, even though we have still been affected by terrorism in Europe. And I am thinking of our German friends and the Magdeburg attack, or our American friends and the New Orleans attack. We know that terrorism is a risk that remains prominent in our societies, and which implies that there is no relaxation and collective vigilance. There must therefore be no respite in the fight against terrorism, and I obviously ask the entire government to continue to be mobilized. The Minister of the Interior in the first place, but under the authority of the Prime Minister, all of his colleagues. We must stand together and continue to do so internationally. In the Middle East, we must look without naivety at the regime change in Syria. I will have the opportunity to return to it, but we also know that it was from this soil that the attacks of 2015 in November were conceived and fomented, and that terrorist groups continue to act in the region. And we must, in the Levant, in the Sahel, in other regions of the world where terrorist groups are organizing, continue extreme vigilance, the mobilization of our network, the organization of our security services. And from the Horn of Africa to the Gulf of Guinea, the Hassan Corps and other regions, we know that the influence of terrorist groups continues to flourish. In short, the threat of footsteps behind us is even quite the opposite. And our role, your role, is to continue to have it in mind, to act, to protect our compatriots through this vigilance. This work of understanding, and also the pursuit of useful alliances to fight against these groups. And I will have the opportunity to come back to it. The wars of the Near East are also not distant conflicts. And speaking of our safety, I want to look at this theater first. Indeed, it is both the safety of the French and our unity, given the seismic aftershocks, in a way, of those who are playing there, that are at stake. That is why, first of all, our solidarity with Israel in the face of terrorism, in the face of the barbarism of the attacks perpetrated by Hamas on its soil on October 7, 2023, is complete and does not suffer any nuance. The hostages still held in Gaza must be released without further delay, and we continue to fight for the release of Ofer Calderon and Oedi Yalomi, our compatriots, as for the release of all hostages. We also understand the need for Israel, that the worst never happens again. It is that the security of its own is fully guaranteed. That is why, moreover, faithful to our historical friendship, we assume our responsibilities by his side. And we have shown it during the last year on every occasion during the Iranian or terrorist attacks. We have also shown this by playing our full role in the conclusion of the ceasefire along the Blue Line, to put an end to the firing by Hezbollah in the interests of Lebanon as well as Israel. It must also be admitted that, whatever one thinks about it, the interventions, in particular targeted Israeli interventions in Lebanon, Syria, Iran, have changed the strategic situation in the Middle East. And for this, we must collectively draw the consequences and reopen the perspective of a solid, lasting, and secure peace for all in the region. This peace cannot be built with a solely security response. It must go through humanitarian and political work, which is its absolute condition. First of all, in Gaza, there is no military justification for the continuation of Israeli operations, for the deliberately placed obstacles to humanitarian aid, and for the state of end and extreme destitution to which the civilian population is reduced. As early as November 2023, France expressed itself by clearly asking for a ceasefire, and by organizing the first humanitarian support conference here. Our priority remains this humanitarian support, in conjunction with our partners in the region, and support for all populations. Beyond that, Israel must immediately put an end to the war, admit that it has partners for peace, and commit itself to a just and lasting settlement of the Palestinian question. By coordinating with all the countries of the region on the Gaza issue, preserving the political conditions in the West Bank and Gaza, for the construction of a Palestinian state, and working with the countries of the region and the international community on the possibility of two states living in peace and security. Peace is possible. Saudi Arabia and our Arab partners of goodwill, Jordan, Egypt, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates in particular, have committed themselves to this one. And France has provided and continues to provide all its support. In this regard, I hope that Europe will act in concert with them to implement the two-state solution, while respecting the security needs of the Israelis as well as the legitimate inspirations of the Palestinians. It will be necessary to be firm on the principles, creative on the modalities, and determined to build a new security and cooperation framework in the Middle East. This is the very objective of the international conference that we have initiated with Saudi Arabia, and which will take place in New York next June. It will be up to us to make this a decisive moment, and it is in this perspective that we will be able to move towards the recognition of the State of Palestine. Our commitment also remains complete in Lebanon, where we have so many of our own, so many friends, and such a long history. We will be there to ensure that calm is permanently restored along the Blue Line with the help of our soldiers serving in the UNIFIL, and our support to the Lebanese armed forces so that they deploy decisively south of the Litany, and obviously our contribution to the ceasefire supervision mechanisms. It was the action of the United States of America and France that made it possible to obtain this ceasefire that some thought impossible a few weeks ago. We are together engaged in this monitoring process and this supervision mechanism, and we give our credit to it. Here too, French pride and French determination. We must also continue this work with patience and humility, and I thank the support of all our soldiers, both in this supervisory mechanism and within FINUL. But we also need to go further and make the political process a success. Jean-Yves Le Drian continues his good offices and has been on site again in recent weeks. And we hope, alongside all the Lebanese political forces, that a president can finally be elected during the January 9 session. That has been scheduled or for the future, because it is the decisive choice. That will only allow the full and complete resumption of Lebanese sovereignty, and therefore the possibility then of forming a government capable of carrying out the necessary reforms. France, with constancy, has committed itself in recent years, also with requirement and lucidity. We are here, we have been there to get this ceasefire, and we will be there in the long term to get this transition. In Syria, let us be proud that we have never given in to the ease of believing that the dictator could be rehabilitated. Let us also remain faithful to our commitment, never denied for 2011 years, for a sovereign Syria, free and respectful of its ethnic, political, and confessional plurality. We will be faithful to our allies in the fight against the Islamic State, and I have said this here with force, because we also know the debt that France owes to all the Syrian democratic forces and freedom fighters like the Kurds, who, by our side in such difficult years, had the courage to fight against terrorist groups. We did not abandon them when some turned their backs on them in 2018. We will not abandon them further in the ongoing process. And we are vigilant about the course of the political transition that is beginning. The Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs, and I thank him for that, visited Damascus with his German colleague a few days ago. And he very clearly recalled our expectations. Integrate all the components of the opposition to the old regime, ensure the safety of refugees for their return to Syria, continue the fight against terrorism with clarity, and dismantle all chemical weapons production structures, and drug production and trafficking networks. We hope that the new Syria will indeed participate in regional security and stability, and it is in this spirit that we will organize a third edition of the Baghdad Conference in the spring to make new concrete projects on a regional scale, in the interest of all, for peace and security. And basically, the agenda that we are pursuing, in Iraq as in Syria, is that of defending both the sovereignty of each of these countries, but also the pluralist model that is constitutive of the latter. But basically, beyond these crises, we can clearly see that the challenge that is posed to us in the region is beyond, and Iran. This is the main strategic and security challenge for France, the Europeans, the whole region is far beyond. The acceleration of its nuclear program brings us very close to the breaking point. His ballistic program threatens European soil and our interests. Iran is already involved in Russia's war against Ukraine by assertive and fully identified military support. His support for the dangerous group on all confrontation grounds in the Middle East, his attempts to deploy it in Africa, further amplify this danger through what are called his proxies, and the claimed practice of terrorism continues. And so, in this context, the Iranian issue is undoubtedly one of the main ones on which we will re-engage in dialogue with the new American administration, and on which, basically, France's vision has also been constant therefore 2018. And remember, when the United States of America decided to denounce the GECPOA that they themselves had promoted, France had a simple vision: we must move towards a broader agreement. This is the line we are wearing today. Iran is a risk if we leave it out of the frame. And we must, on the nuclear issue, on the issue of ballistic activity, on regional destabilization maneuvers, in fact, have an overall discussion and build verifiable, irreversible solutions. These require engaging both the US administration and the main countries in the region. Europe is credible because it is constant in this matter. France, but with it its main partners. We have not varied in recent years. We were more demanding, even before the agreements of 2015. We have helped to harden them. Moreover, in the coming months, we will have to ask ourselves the question of using, and we are ready to do so if the question arises, the mechanisms for reinstating sanctions by next October. But we need to engage more broadly in order to have a more demanding treaty. In my opinion, this is one of the priority topics of the strategic discussion with the United States of America. And for the entire region, I just mentioned Iran. Our other major security and strategic challenge is obviously Russia, with the war in Ukraine and beyond. Here too, I know, fatigue sometimes spreads. Fatigue of support for Ukraine. Doubt that dissolves the goodwill, that calls into question the amounts and the meaning of our assistance. I've seen a lot of comments in recent months to say that the arrival of President Trump, it would be the end of everything. Quick and other solutions. First of all, I want to tell you that, here too, we are trying to be constant, and it pays off. And that we have engaged in the diplomatic battle, because nothing has ever been written. France organized the first exchange between President Trump and President Zelensky right here in Paris last December, which made it possible to identify all the challenges of what is at stake there, the reality of the conflict on the ground, and the need to provide answers that will undoubtedly take a little longer than they were initially anticipated, which is a good thing. But here I want to say why what is happening in Ukraine is so important. Because it somehow concerns international security and the very direct interests of the Europeans and the French. First of all, international security, because uninhibited revisionism and imperialism are at play here. If we let an international power review internationally recognized borders without reaction, and international law be trampled underfoot and by fatigue, because it would cost us dearly or because this, or because it's somehow accepted to compromise, good luck for the future. Because it simply means that everyone's credibility will be undermined. And so on this day, the credibility of the international order and its rules, but above all because in recent years, Russia has accelerated its aggressiveness, and also changed the nature of its aggressiveness towards Europeans and a good part of the planet. Radical changes. Radical in this behavior with regard to the nuclear doctrine, that it has strongly hardened in the threat to its neighbors. This is not totally a novelty, because we had seen a tension increase in recent decades. It is now much clearer, much more explicit. In Armenia, where Russia, by abruptly changing its alliance, supported Azerbaijan's actions because for the first time, it had a prime minister with courage who stood up to it. In Georgia, where she obviously destabilized the electoral process and falsified it. In Moldova, where she tried the same thing, failing. And I salute the courage and determination of President Maya Sandu, but it is up to us collectively to be vigilant for the legislative elections that will come in a few months. And I could also talk here again about the Romanian elections, where Russia was not shy about manipulating the electoral process in one of the member countries of the European Union. Through its multiple tests, it has threatened European soil by showing its clear ability to reach it with advanced technologies, and multiply disturbances also in the cyberspace. And she de facto decided to globalize the Ukrainian conflict. There is only one escalating power in Ukraine, and that is Russia. By associating Iran, as I mentioned, to produce components, by having an approach with many Chinese components on dual structures. And this is the demanding dialogue that we have with China, and de facto, by involving North Korea in the conflict there too. Who would have thought even 5 years ago that North Korea would get involved in a conflict on European soil? This is where we are, and this is Russia's responsibility. And therefore, in a few semesters, the nature of the conflict has changed profoundly, and this is Russia's total responsibility. That is why what we said here last February is undoubtedly even more true today. We cannot, as Europeans, let Russia win in Ukraine. We cannot do it for the sake of the international order. We cannot do it for our own security. And so the question is not to know if or that. The question is to know how to organize ourselves in order, in fact, to last for a long time, to allow the Ukrainians to resist, to be in the best conditions to be able to negotiate a lasting peace, that is to say a peace that will be wanted, conceived with the Ukrainians, and also to make it possible to find ways and means of framing this Russian threat. For all of us Europeans. Let us have no illusions about this, and I believe that it is becoming increasingly clear to everyone. There will be no quick and easy solution in Ukraine. The new American president is himself that the United States has no chance of winning anything if Ukraine loses. And I will say in a very simple way, in a way, the few lines, no solution must be found in Ukraine without the Ukrainians. No solution must be found for security in Europe without the Europeans. No quick solution that would mean the capitulation of Ukraine can be good for the Europeans and the Americans. Once we have these simple principles in mind, we must put ourselves in a position, whatever the scenarios, to provide lasting support to Ukraine in order to be able to resist, to be in the best situations, to be able to negotiate. And basically, the United States of America has to help us to change the nature of the situation and convince Russia to come to the negotiating table. The Ukrainians have to bring realistic discussions on territorial issues, and only they can lead them. And the Europeans have to build security guarantees, which will be their responsibilities in the first place, because it is a geographical and geopolitical reality. All this leads me, basically, when we look at the moment, to realize together that we are facing a profound change in the strategic environment that is ours. The war in Europe, Russia, which has completely transformed its war industry, and which today produces as much as all Europeans. We have done a lot. We have made this war economy. We have welcomed it, but we are very far from what we Europeans must do. The totality of Europeans, it is an effort of production, industry, defense, technological base, which is that of Russia. The United States is accelerating this effort and is having increasingly uninhibited strategic discussions. China continues to produce an arsenal, again whose magnitude is not on our scale, let's be clear. And so, in this context, France has assets. That of having anticipated this transformation by a reinvestment since 2019. But very clearly, there is an acceleration, a transformation of the threat, and a profound change in the strategic environment, which is proliferating, escalatory, and uninhibited. And he is in all areas. I could have mentioned here, beyond that, maritime, space, and cyber. And so we have to react here. France has a nuclear weapon, a strong army that it has repaired, and that it has projected into the future, with an innovation strategy. We have an alliance, NATO, which must adapt to threats in the Euro-Atlantic area without seeking to deploy beyond, at the risk otherwise of diluting its resources. And we have a European Union that must continue to gain in robustness. And basically, all that I mentioned earlier that we have, under French impetus, managed to get this European pillar of defense to Europe, it is very good. But this is already not enough. And so we have to go now much faster and much stronger. And so, in a way, on many of these strategic axes, we have seen it right. But there is such an acceleration and transformation of the threat that we need to harden our position and go much further. And so the adoption of the strategic compass, the desire to commit more to our industrial and technological defense base, the launch of the European Intervention Initiative, the acceleration of ambitious industrial programs, all this was necessary. Now we need to go further. First, with a massive European investment program and assuming a European preference. At the moment, when we are discussing this famous program called EDIP, I say it very clearly. The question is not whether we need such a ceiling, such a floor. We keep talking like we did 10 years ago. The question is whether the Europeans want for the next 20 years to produce what will be necessary for their security or not. It is a safe bet that in 15 to 20 years, the American priority will be their own defense, and will be much more around the China Sea and in this region than on the borders of Europe. And if we depend on the American defense industrial and technological base, then we will have cruel dilemmas and guilty strategic dependencies. We Europeans must produce more of our own capacities. We have started to do this with initiatives with our German, British, Italian friends, with the Élysée initiative, with several European partners, but we need more ambition and a real European preference in our programs. We also need to go much further on a European scale, more investment within the European Union, and also more ambition within the European political community, which must be a place of construction, cooperation, defense. Why? Because it is continent-wide. And it's not the same message or the same grammar as that of NATO. And the European political community that France proposed in 2022, which is a reality today. We must harden it on the military and strategic level because it is the right perimeter to make the British, the Europeans of the European Union, the Ukrainians, the Moldovans, the whole of the Balkans, and the Norwegians work together. That is to say, countries that today are facing the same strategic challenges, and that are not necessarily all in the same geopolitical fora. The political community brings them together because, as Europeans, they have this strategic challenge to embrace. Finally, speaking of our security, here I want to have a word for immigration. Yes, to protect French women and men, their security is to protect our borders. I have had the opportunity here several times to come back to it, and I want to say a word about it. Indeed, Europe, in the last 10 years, has been shaken up by several migratory phenomena. She herself has experienced a deep political crisis in several countries and in her ability to cooperate. But today it has instruments, and we have a collective mobilization to have which must allow us to rise to this challenge. First, under the French presidency, we have restarted the European dialogue on the issue of immigration asylum. Indeed, by taking the initiative of a gradual approach, we have emerged from the crisis that had completely blocked the progress of European texts for 2015 years. And the Immigration Asylum Pact is a major step forward for Europeans in terms of their ability to face precisely this challenge. This is the end of the hypocrisy of a system that left some on the front line. The end of selfishness with the idea that there can be no single rider and that everyone must take their part. The end of postures too, by assuming the unconditionality of asylum in order to better guarantee its effectiveness, and by tracking down the fraud, the abuses, the circumventations that are eating away at this system. And with this pact, we have also equipped ourselves with means of control and registration on arrival on European soil and monitoring, but also with more efficient mechanisms for return. That is why France's strategy in this context is to accelerate the implementation of the Asylum and Immigration Pact, to complete and strengthen it on returns, to use all European levers to promote cooperation with third countries and the real mission, and continuing to strengthen the protection of the external borders of the European Union. All this response at European level is what, under the authority of the Prime Minister and the Minister of the Interior, and the Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs and all colleagues will bring to the European fora. We believe in this organized, proactive approach. And let me be clear, I sometimes hear about innovative approaches in Europe. I will be very careful about these approaches, which very often do not comply with European law, which is ours, with the conventions that we have given to ourselves. But above all, anyone who has seen them walk, I am very interested. That's not true. What has been effective in Europe is what I am talking about, which is a cooperative and demanding European approach. Nationalist approaches don't work. In particular for France, Germany, Italy, Spain, which, until more radical change, are not cities and therefore are dependent on cooperation with neighboring countries. And so what works, what produces results, is a more demanding European approach, protection of our borders, monitoring of migration and secondary flows within the European Union, and more demanding dialogue with countries of origin and third countries. It's not about going to repatriate people to countries that have never seen them. It's not about somehow going to brandish threats to international law. It's not true. This is what we are doing, and what the ministers are engaged on night and morning, to protect the French, and the French precisely. But here too, we, for our own sake, must be more demanding and more consistent. And I believe that we must know how to listen to the French in their demands, which seems to me common sense, and which we share. We want to integrate better, welcome better, but the people are demanding to regain control, and our compatriots, basically, no longer understand that, even though we have dangerous people on our soil, that we want to be able to expel them. They are not being taken over by certain countries, to which we should issue visas without requirement. One would come back with me that common sense contravenes this precept. That's sometimes what we still do a little. So, the radical and blind method does not work well. It has been tested in some countries. Lucidity here too must lead us to see that, basically, it is simply necessary to have an extremely precise, rigorous commitment, but which consists of being much more demanding with the countries so that they cooperate more on these policies. And so, here too, under the authority of the Prime Minister, the Ministers of Foreign Affairs and the Interior will have a job. And I hope that there will be a very close coordination between the embassies, the consulate services, and our Ministry of the Interior, our prefects, so that here too, first of all, we implement the Hermelin report, which I believe says extremely precisely the things that are quite relevant to this strategy, and succeed in having a requirement, and to somehow look at our consular policy by targeting, moreover, the effects that we seek for certain audiences, which generally allow us to have faster reactions, and not to touch the binationals or the people who participate in the vitality of the bilateral relationship, but to be more demanding, with certain countries that do not deliver the past consular tests that are expected for us to have an effective migration policy. We cannot accept in the long term when there is a non-cooperation on this aspect. And so I really ask for a very high requirement, results in this matter. We must continue to be an attractive country. We want to continue to attract talent. We want to continue to have a chosen immigration. We want to continue to have official development assistance, which we have also increased, a real voluntarism. We want to continue to have precisely this circulation of all. But we must do it with a certain requirement and lucidity, and also know how to talk to authorities, when they are not playing the game on consular passes for irregulars who are on our soil. This work is essential, and it is one for which I know the government is deeply committed. Beyond immigration, we will also continue to strengthen the fight against all crime networks, in particular drug traffickers, again for which cooperation is absolutely essential in this area. The second axis, and the second priority on which I expect a lot from you, from us, for this year, is the prosperity, the growth of France and Europe. A lot has been said about this, and I won't go into it for a long time, but Europe, which has done a lot in recent years, to keep moving forward, to reform itself, and face a real risk of stalling against the United States of America and China. The state reports, the Draghi report, many reports by eminent economists in France and elsewhere have identified it. There are also all the numbers that can be summoned. Only one is enough to illuminate it. I was talking about the quarter of a century. In 25 years, American GDP per capita has grown twice as fast as European GDP per capita. And the United States of America is better positioned in terms of investment and investment mass than the Europeans, on green technologies, artificial intelligence, and the defense industry. Then we can have the spirit of defeat. We're screwed, it's over. And let's buy American, basically. And I must say sometimes that in the behaviors or in the evidences that some defend, we are there. And I tell you, I think there is no inevitability in this matter. Why Europe would be the pool of talents who will work in California, the savings bank of foreign exchanges. We who are the continent that has the most savings and the final market of China. It's a choice, it's a strategic choice. The path that France is taking is to do the opposite. It is to say to ourselves, basically, this single market that we have created is not simply the triumph of consumers, but it is a striking force. We have 450 million inhabitants within the European Union. The United States of America is 350 million inhabitants. But we've always looked at it as basically a form of adjustment. We opened our market to get other people's graces. We said we're going to buy American for defense, that's our umbrella. We're going to try to be nice to the Chinese because it's an opportunity market, and then now we're letting them in. There is no inevitability in this. And so the European strategic awakening that we started with the notions that I explained earlier, with what I was starting to say on the question of defense, it must be radical on the possibility of European and French prosperity, without naivety. And this is, moreover, the only way to be respected by the Americans, the Chinese, and the big emerging countries. As long as we give them a speech that is the opposite of what they do for them and at home, we will be seen as the great novice of history. And so, basically, people who are already disappearing. They know that we are already getting older, that we produce less than energy, that we buy it more expensive. And here they are saying to each other, and on top of that, they are nice. It's not a profession to be nice. And in any case, this is not how we will build our future. And so, yes, in this matter, I propose to have a European strategy and a French strategy. The European strategy, it holds in a few words, and that, for me, is the agenda for 2025 and beyond. But it is in 2025 that a lot will be played out with the incoming Commission. And the European states have a key role, because I remind you, the impetus is given by the Council, and it is carried out by the Commission. And so I will gather several colleagues here in February, and starting in March. We will carry this ambition to have a Europe that responds to these challenges. The number one point of this European strategy is simplification. We have a huge problem, and there it is necessary to do our collective mea culpa. We have all co-produced there in recent years. Europe has become out of sync with the rest of the world, sometimes with the best intentions, but we invest less, we innovate less, but we over-legalize. So that doesn't work at all. And we overreact in almost all areas. And so we must resynchronize the European regulatory agenda. And we legislate with the best intentions in the world. We ourselves have introduced certain regulations with very good intentions, and I share their philosophy. But in the moment that we are living, we must somehow know how to suspend them, until we have somehow regained the ability to re-enter the competition. Otherwise, we will be swept out of the field of innovation. So simplification, that must go much further than a simple grooming. We need to take a massive regulatory pause, but we need to revisit regulations, including recent ones, that hinder our ability to innovate. And on this, we simply have to look very lucidly at where we are, which allows us to move forward or not. And it is this requirement that we must have with regard to Europe. On simplification, the second element is called the single market. We must go to the end of the single market in order to have a real domestic market for our companies. We have a great growth lever that does not cost a euro of public money. It is to remove the barriers between the 27 member countries. And so in all areas where it already exists, we have to accelerate it. If we want our startups, our giant champions of artificial intelligence, to be in the international competition, it is just necessary that their domestic market is not the French market, but the European Union market. Deepening of the European market. This is exactly the key, also in terms of digital, in terms of energy, telecommunications. On these key areas, we must break the rules between the 27 and harmonize them much faster. We must move much faster on a single energy market, and the interconnectivity of electrical interconnections is a priority for European growth, because today, let's pay for our non-electrical competitiveness in this area, well, rather energy. Even though Europeans have renewable and nuclear capacities, we simply do not know how to pool them and circulate them freely at the right cost on our soil. And therefore, the single market is a decisive element of simplification. The second element of the European strategy is to rethink trade. I was saying it earlier, because we have been too naive. And so rethinking commerce means, first of all, knowing how to protect ourselves and ensure the loyalty of exchanges. In September 2023, when I was speaking to you, I was already defending this argument. By talking about Chinese electric vehicles, I remember very well, I was talking in front of you about the differences in taxation that there were between China and Europe. And it is a very good thing that the European Commission has taken this up. And I am totally defending what the Commission has done on electric vehicles. It was a very strong signal. So we will continue to stand by our producers who have suffered the retaliatory measures. And that our cognac and Armagnac producers know the mobilization of the entire government of France, say as well. And I thank Jean-Pierre Raffarin, who has done one of his multiple missions of good offices with our ministers in this matter. And will keep moving forward. The Prime Minister will have the opportunity to visit China to get what he was telling us on this subject. But we're right to do that. If there is no trade loyalty, there is no possibility of producing competitively on European soil. And so, this is simply what the Chinese and Americans are doing for themselves. So Europe has started to get into this dynamic. We must go further and defend a European content in our production. And so, on electric vehicles, it's not enough, which we did. Because otherwise the manufacturers will go looking for Chinese subcontractors and will go assembled in Europe. But we must defend, in each part of the major value chains, the ability to produce European goods. This idea, I assure you, is not decidedly heterodox. She is not a crypto-Marxist. And it is not contrary to international trade. This is simply what the United States of America has been doing for decades for itself, and with its partners in NAFTA. Simply, we have forbidden it to ourselves. And basically, we're thinking, which might be a good idea, but I still haven't understood. At a time when the tow rules are no longer respected by either China or the United States of America, well, no. We're going to continue to do it, but on our own. It's not working. So let's wake up, let's look at what is being done. And so, we must defend through our commercial policy, and precisely ensure a level of competition that is fair. And we must defend European content, it is essential. And then, we must be coherent, and therefore, have a European commercial agenda. That is coherent with our regulatory and climate agenda. And so put measures that are called close mirrors or safeguard measures that allow us to defend this agenda. I cannot explain why we are reducing the ability of our producers, for example in the field of agriculture, to use certain phytosanitary products, and at the same time, open free trade agreements to powers that do not use them, so that they come to our market. That, and when you don't know how to explain it to someone on the street, it's usually a bad sign. So this is a bad idea. And that is why France defended, for example, the CETA, the agreement with Chile, the agreement with New Zealand. Because they have substantial mirror clauses, because they have safeguard measures that allow us to regulate things, in the event of an imbalance. But in view of the information that has been given to us on Mercosur, these provisions do not exist today in this agreement. There is no safeguard clause if certain markets are destabilized. There are no real mirror clauses. And so today, we have to be much more demanding. It's just a signature. And I reassure you there too, for all those who think that everything would be lost, and that it is an erasure of France, that the Commission has signed the agreement with Mercosur. Longevity gives me a privilege, it's to maybe have a little perspective. And I have already signed a Mercosur agreement, more exactly attended a signing at the Osaka G8. It was then swept away because the same ones they had signed did not respect what they said they would do. It was the beginning of Mr. Bolsonaro's Brazil. I reassure you, Mass is not said, would say John the good layman, in this Republican palace. But we will continue to defend forcefully the consistency of our commitments, and therefore coherent commercial policy. And then the Europeans have to look at the national security criteria for their trade policy. The American approach must inspire us. The Chinese approach must be looked at. We cannot be the only ones to consider that when we talk about telecommunications, operators, when we talk about a lot of sectors, mobility and assisted vehicles in the United States of America, it is a national security criterion, which allows them to control access to their market for electric vehicles and certain assistance devices. It looks at itself. If it is for the Americans, maybe it must be for the Europeans. So here too, we need a real awakening and greater lucidity. The third element is to assume an industrial and innovation policy. So simplify, have a commercial policy that changes its nature and protects, and have a real industrial and innovation policy. Here too, in the last 7 years, we have transformed things. Industrial policy was a big word in Europe, under the first mandate of Ursula von der Leyen. With the remarkable work of Thierry Breton, common industrial policies were launched. Semiconductors, batteries, hydrogen. We had real European projects. That's a good thing. We need to go much further and much stronger on artificial intelligence, cleantech, and defense. And in all these areas, we must have a more proactive and much more ambitious European industrial and innovation policy. As such, France will have to host the Artificial Intelligence Summit on February 10 and 11 next year. A summit for action, we called it. So, this summit will make it possible to have an international conversation about artificial intelligence. There will be, in particular, Prime Minister Modi, who on this occasion will follow up with an important visit to our country. And because we precisely want to conduct, if I may say so, a dialogue with all the powers on artificial intelligence, the United States of America, China, but also major emerging countries such as India, which have a key role to play, and the Gulf powers. And so, beyond this conversation, about what we want to do for the public interest with a foundation that we are going to set up, and a whole series of topics on which we will have the opportunity to return. For me, the heart of this summit will be innovation and the ability to attract talent. And it is to put the French and the Europeans back at the heart of the battle for artificial intelligence. Training, investment, and on all segments of the value chain, to say that we have a role to play, but that for this, we need to invest more and succeed in continuing to train. We already have a lot of assets, but we must scale up, train, invest, deploy. And so I want to share with you all, it is the mobilization of the entire network of diplomats for this Artificial Intelligence Summit. And indeed our ability to carry a French and European strategy for artificial intelligence for the coming years. The fourth and final axis of this European strategy for growth and prosperity is investments and the budget. All this can only be done by investing much more. And so we have to preempt the budget discussion right now. More own resources, capacity to invest over time, and to borrow on the markets, but Europeans must invest more together. It is not simply national state aid that fragmented the single market. It is a capacity of Europeans to invest on priorities, on green industries, on defense, precisely on artificial intelligence. And to do it on a large scale, it is almost a doubling of the budget that we have to do. This is what we have been able to do during the COVID period. And in a way, the challenge is not of the same nature, but it is at least of the same magnitude. And so that's what we have to build. And at the same time, to better mobilize European savings, we are the continent that saves the most, it is simply not allocated well, and goes to others. The key to this is called reforming European capital markets and having a real Europe of savings and investment. And here too, it is one of the priority projects of the coming months at European level. This European prosperity strategy must be consolidated by a French strategy. First, it is through a macroeconomic policy. We have had established results for 7 years in terms of attractiveness, lower unemployment, reindustrialization. And I know how much the Prime Minister wants to consolidate this policy of supply and attractiveness. And he will have the opportunity to return to it in the coming days in his general policy speech. The second axis is to consolidate our attractiveness with the appointments of Truth France. Next May we will have a new edition. It will continue to be very important, and I want to thank all the stakeholders, Business France, Be France, the entire export team, as we say in good French, all of our networks there too, who are mobilized. Because we must continue to attract investment in almost all sectors and increase the attractiveness of France. Here too, it is to serve French prosperity and all French territories by this ability to have an attractiveness policy. And thanks to your mobilization to all in recent years, we have been able to create tens of thousands of jobs in all territories of the country. And every year, I went to devote these investments. There is not a region that has been excluded by the latter. And so we have to continue this work. So macroeconomic growth and supply policy, attractiveness strategy, strategy to secure our supplies. We have built a strategy on rare ores, critical materials, rare earths, which was developed 2 years ago. We are in the process of deploying it. Here I want to emphasize your mobilization to all. In many of the countries where you are, there are still capacities that are not exploited, and that will allow us to secure all our sectors. We are far from having obtained the result, and if we want a more independent France that will succeed in the coming years in the face of these great challenges, we must secure on lithium, on uranium, on cobalt, on a lot, precisely, of its capabilities. And this is a real diplomatic game that began several years ago with a Chinese aggressiveness that is known to all. Here too, we have been able to do this in recent years by the policy we have pursued with regard to Mongolia, for example. Unprecedented, but which allows for first results. The agreement that I launched with the first trip that had been made to Mongolia was presented to Parliament in December. And so from Mongolia to many countries in South America and Africa, we have strategies, critical materials, rare minerals to pursue. And really, I am counting on your mobilization, and I will also ask here that the ministers can come back to this roadmap. Beyond that, we must continue to improve our trade balance and densify our export support policy. I will hold a presidential council on foreign trade next May, and the Prime Minister will have the opportunity, with the competent ministers, to review each of these sectors. But even if we are already doing a lot, the French commercial record is not good, and we know it. Why? First of all, because we have an energy dependence. She's here. And so I also say it for all those who think that France's climate decarbonization strategy would be a fad of progressives. Those who want to improve the country's carbon balance and at the same time reduce its commercial dependence should have only one priority, which is to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. It turns out that they are not produced and do not cost us dearly, and this is the heart of our trade deficit. So all mobilized to decarbonize the French economy. This is the best way to improve the French trade balance. Not. That also puts things back in place a little. The second element is that we have sectors where we still have a huge export potential. The agri-food industry is driven by flagships, as we know, wines and spirits, and some sectors. But from seeds to many other sectors, much more can be done. The health sector, the energy sector, the city of tomorrow, and sustainable city sector, the tech sectors, etc., still have a considerable export potential, on which I want us to organize a sector and country strategy to rebalance it. Because all this is work that has already been done several times, but on which we must be able to do even better given the assets that are ours today. And that we can also put all our instruments in tension. We have increased our official development assistance. We have appropriations, whatever the instruments of AFT, which I welcome the mobilization of, which are there. I think we must also evaluate everything that has been done in recent years. And I can't say that it is sometimes a success when we see large projects that we finance at great expense with French public operators that allow Chinese or other private operators to deploy their industrial offer. On this, we also need to resynchronize things a little at home. And so let's look at the return on investment for our own companies, for our own sectors. There is no inevitability. In any case, I think that in an era of scarce money in which we are, and we will continue to be, it is clear that we must mobilize all the channels on the financing side to maximize this impact. It is essential. And then, to succeed in this and this prosperity strategy, we must diversify our partnerships. Here too, I will not be exhaustive, but I want to cite a few points. We have growth partnerships that I want us to reinvest in. First, our British friends. We will hold a new Franco-British summit in 2025 for a new ambition at the Lancaster House Treaty, and to renew our strategic cooperation. It is obviously not only economic topics. And for me, we must, together with our British neighbors, do much more. The second is Europe in the broadest sense. I was talking about European political communities earlier when I was talking about strategic aspects, but this is an economic growth potential that we need to mobilize much better. And let's be clear, at the time of the last massive act of enlargement that we carried, France benefited much less from enlargement than our German neighbors. We have been less well organized and less proactive. There is no inevitability in this. Europe unites its 700 million inhabitants, and therefore consumers. It is a relatively homogeneous market of wealthier people than the global average. This is a land of expansion. And so I hope that within this, we also have a partnership growth strategy based on this desire to do. The Indo-Pacific, beyond strategic topics, what have I had the opportunity to say in recent years? Is obviously for us a priority land. I think there is France, there is a singular path. Since 2018, we have built a strategy, it is coherent. Then we Europeanized it. And this is a strategy that helps to achieve a form of independence from China, the number of states, without being conflicting. And we kind of have the beauty of the third party. We are not subservient to Chinese interests in the region. We are present there through our ultramarine territories, but we are not in a strategy of confrontation. And we do not intend to enter it, unlike the United States of America. We have a huge potential in the Indo-Pacific, which has also allowed us to build historic defense contracts there. The largest defense contract of the last decades from France, much superior in terms of return on French industry. Then the late Hocus contract, for which we had a setback alliance, is the one we built with the United Arab Emirates, which is a remarkable contract in strategic and defense terms. But beyond the United Arab Emirates, what we have with Qatar, with India, with Indonesia, and with a lot of power in the region, the ability we have to link this presence with Djibouti and what surrounds us is decisive. And so, we still have considerable potential in the Indo-Pacific. In fact, they're also for our prosperity. In the entire field of defense industries, which means that I will travel to Singapore for the Shangri-La Dialogue next spring, and then to several countries in the region. In South America, there too, taking care of the old affinities that we have, looking for mutually beneficial agreements in all sectors. We have a growth strategy to build. This is what we have also revived there with President Lula's Brazil, what we have consolidated in recent years with Argentina. And with a common thread, it is precisely the decarbonized industry and critical metals. This continent has potential. I was referring to Chile earlier with the agreements signed, and which we consolidated with the recent visit that I was able to make there. But in most of these countries, there are also strategies that are very consistent with ours. And I am thinking in particular of the supply security agreements that we have signed and of decarbonized growth with Brazil. In the Arabian Peninsula, we must amplify our cross-investment strategy. Saudi Arabia was the opportunity to do this last month. But we also have long-term trusted partners with whom we have several opportunities. And it is in this prosperity agenda, and these new partnerships, that I want to evoke the African continent. And I want to do it there too, with a lot of gratitude for all the work you do and clarity. First, we have an agenda that must somehow come out of the obsessions of the past. I have made every effort, and I will continue to do so, to look at historical, cultural, and memorial issues. I believe that we have done this with great sincerity in recent years, and affirm the unprecedented work that has been done on Algeria. With the Stora Commission, through the speech that was given at the time by the Minister in Thiaroye for Senegal, to the policy of restitution of works of art in accordance with the Ouagadougou agenda that I had mentioned. We have, in recent years, profoundly changed this software. That is to say that France looks at its past in its completeness. She has named things, and she seeks to have a scientific, historiographical approach, both uninhibited and outdated. And we will do it again with Cameroon, with the Historians Committee that we have installed. And I totally accept this policy, it is good. And I say it as president of the republic born after decolonization, in a continent that has 75% to less than 25 years. The dialogue with Africa cannot be hostage to a Pan-Africanism of good faith contemporary, which uses in a way a post-colonial discourse by having moreover backers who are the imperialists of today. And so this kind of combination of false intellectuals manipulating social networks, using the disarray of a youth, and the interests of Russia or other Africa, let's be clear-headed, but let's not give in to it. And so in this context, no, France is not declining in Africa. She is simply lucid, she is reorganizing herself. I say this because, when I read a good part of our press, and a lot of comments, people looking with yesterday's glasses say, it's terrible. Africa, we are disappearing. No, we chose to move to Africa. We chose to move because we had to move. One, we looked at our past relationship, memorial, cultural. We invoice it, we assume it, we tell each other the truth. But we don't give in to disinformation and interference. 2. We had a safe relationship. She was of two natures, in truth. There is a part, it was our commitment against terrorism, for 2013. We were right. I think we forgot to say thank you. It doesn't matter, it will come with time. Ingratitude, I am in a good position to know, is a non-communicable disease to humans. But I say it for all the African rulers who have not had the courage vis-a-vis their public opinions to wear it. None of them would be with a sovereign country today if the French army had not deployed in this region. And I have an emotional thought for our soldiers who sometimes gave their lives and 4 years fought. We did well. We left because there were coups d'état, because we were there at the request of sovereign states who had asked France to come. From the moment there were coups, when people said, our priority is no longer the fight against terrorism, it's this or that, whatever. France no longer had a place there because we are not the deputies of putschists. So we left. And then we decided, this is the second part, to reorganize our military presence. Why? Because we kind of had an afterglow. And we were feeding a post-colonial discourse ourselves. Because in the French-speaking African countries, there was this history, and therefore, we had allowed a presence to settle in our bases. Did she still have a greater justification? Was that the influence of France? No. Hi everyone who has served. It wasn't there anymore. And it was no longer understood, it was used. That is to say that all the activist networks that I mentioned were coming to say, look at the French. They have a camp with 2,000 soldiers there, so they are going to prepare a coup d'état. And all possible misinformation was being used against us. So we have patiently, and I thank Jean-Marie Bockel, I thank him in two ways, personally and for this mission. Because he is one of those who lived in his flesh, and the flesh of his family, which I mentioned earlier. But he patiently carried out this mission, in conjunction with the ministers and the CMA. And so we proposed to the African heads of state to reorganize our presence. As we are very polite, we left the primacy of the announcement to them. And make no mistake, we have it. And sometimes it was necessary to push. But I am not going because we are polite, correct, and we are reorganizing ourselves. That it would have to be turned against us by saying they are being driven out of Africa. I can tell you that in many of these countries, we didn't want to remove the French army or even reorganize it. But we took it on together. That's the partnership. And so yes, we are opening a new security and defense partnership where we will have strategic bases. Djibouti is one of them, which is why it is of a completely different nature. I mentioned it in front of our military. It will be perennial, stable, because it is regional. And we will ask our partners to know how to express their needs in terms of defense. But we are going to do more training, more equipment, more information, more contracts, also in the duration of defense. We're going to qualify the threat with them. And we are also going to invent a new relationship, as we have done in recent years with Benin, an unprecedented relationship, as we are going to do with Nigeria, where we started a strategic dialogue that did not exist until then, which was an aberration, etc. And beyond that, the African continent is a continent of growth. And on this, we are too cautious. And I also say it because when I always read the press, French people are obsessed with French-speaking Africa. We must look at Francophone Africa with pride. We have interests there, we have dear friendships among the leaders, in civil society, and elsewhere. But finally, we did well to make the first big trip in 25 years, from Nigeria to France a few weeks ago. 25 years. It is only a country with 250 million inhabitants. The benefit of going to Kenya for the first time, can you imagine? The benefit of returning for the second time to Ethiopia, a country of more than 100 million inhabitants. To have consolidated an energy and investment strategy with South Africa. Our glasses on Africa are no longer the right ones when we talk about Africa. It is a continent where there are great emerging markets, there are tremendous growth potentials. And we are sometimes in the process of divesting. And so we must regain boldness, rethink our financing. And on this, we must, in interdepartmental, rethink our financing to take more risks and accompany more risks. Rethink our European rules so that we have a financing capacity of our major players. And have a strategy with our entrepreneurs, all sectors combined, much more ambitious with regard to the African continent. She looked at it as a continent of opportunity on the commercial and economic issue, on the food and agricultural issue, on the issue of innovation in all fields, on the artistic and cultural issue, on the sports issue, which are also areas where we have expertise, where we have shown them to the whole world, in particular with the Olympic and Paralympic Games, and where there is a whole export strategy that we must deploy. Because all the French actors who worked for our games, we want them to go work for the African Cup of Nations and others great competitions. And that it is, in doing so, a policy that supports what we do in educational and other matters. And so I trust you so that this software that we started changing in Ouagadougou will be re-explained, ported, assumed each time as a conquest software. Like all transitions, it's difficult because there are nostalgic people. Because there are people who don't understand or don't want to understand, and because we're shaking up vested interests. But believe me, this is a good thing because the world is changing, and we need to embrace this new partnership precisely. And let's talk about the African continent. This is in particular what we want to do with the Maghreb. For me, one of the important moments of these last months has been what we managed to build with His Majesty King Mohammed VI. During the state visit, several of you accompanied me there a few weeks ago. We have built a partnership for the coming decades totally new. It is in all fields, it is of unprecedented ambition, and it is for me truly constitutive of this new approach. He must also be one of our relays with regard to a reinvented African approach. That is to say that we will have Franco-Moroccan projects on the African continent. Because it is also another way of approaching this continent, and changing the way we look at France when we approach it together. And so the Maghreb will also, in this strategy, for me, be at the heart of a positive agenda. The Maghreb Season, the Maghreb Fund, the Talent Academy. And we must not resolve, despite the tensions that may exist with some, to the need to have such an agenda. Finally, this prosperity agenda, we must also think about it in these partnership strategies with our overseas territories. I have had the opportunity to say this several times, but we have not succeeded collectively, and it is a question of organization. To succeed in truly putting archipelagic France at the heart of our international strategy. France is an archipelago. Too rarely do we look at it like that and say that it's just a hexagon. Our ultramarine territories allow us to be at the heart of all continents. And since we are at the same time a great Jacobin country, and all our ultramarine territories have this Jacobinism in them, each with their own history, they are always looking at Paris. This is not always the best way to have a growth strategy and optimize our potentials. We must have a regional strategy for all our ultramarine territories. I launched this 7 years ago. It was put at the heart of the strategy at the Ministry of Overseas Territories. And I am confident in the authority of the Prime Minister so that the Minister of State and the Minister of Europe can really build. In connection there also with the prefects and ambassadors, real strategies. So we have re-established ourselves in recent years in regional formats. I am delighted that Martinique has joined CARICOM. We fought to be a member of the Indian Ocean Commission in the Indian Ocean. The meeting was able to join. We will now fight so that Mayotte can join. We also fought with the South Pacific Unit, the IFIP. And so, in recent years, in all regional fora, we have done a lot of diplomatic work to reintegrate ourselves into these fora. Sometimes we were totally absent. Now it's here. It is now necessary to bring them to life, but to have strategies for research, growth, potential in all areas of activity. With the countries of the sub-region. Having a strategy on sport and Jamaica against our West Indies, it's not a bad idea. Having a development strategy with all the countries of the Indian Ocean in terms of tourism, development. Helping Mayotte to meet the challenges of reconstruction with obviously reunion, but the whole sub-region, that's what we need to do. Managing to have a strategy in New Caledonia and French Polynesia, they're also with the entire sub-region, is obviously what we are building and that we must accelerate. Having an Amazon strategy for Guyana is exactly what we want with Brazil. It is a potential return for our compatriots in these territories that is transformative. And I thank the government, so mobilized for Mayotte, both the emergency and its reconstruction. Here too, cooperation with the sub-region will be decisive, including in terms of migration. And we will have to have demanding and respectful cooperation with the big neighbors, including the Comoros. I hear the easy words that are sometimes said. We always have podium successes that we have on the spot. We will insult the Comoros. The reality is that, first of all, things are always more complicated, than we want to make believe, but then, that above all, we must also engage in a demanding but respectful dialogue there. And this is what we will do with the entire subregion. Finally, and I will end on this, I assure you, and it will be shorter, after the protection and prosperity, on the ability that we will have to build our common solutions. In all these disorders, we still have some challenges on which we must continue to build a capacity to act together, and where France has a singular role to play, in particular for the coming months. Climate change, health and food inequalities, the role of finance, and the defense of our democracies. Climate first, as I was saying, the Paris agreements are 10 years old. They were already threatened in 2017 when President Trump announced his exit. I think the situation is even more serious today, if I had to be honest with you. Because at the same time President Trump is threatening an exit from his agreements. But he is uninhibitedly resuming massive fossil fuel production and is going to launch uninhibited production in many countries. And that in recent years, a misunderstanding has been formed with the South, and in particular many African countries, on fossil fuels, and in a way lessons that the Europeans, the Westerners, would give to the latter to forbid them who to do here with gas or oil. And so there is a very significant risk of a regression of our agenda in the coming months. So faced with this, I think we need to re-engage. This is in any case the role of France, first of all, to absolutely help Brazil to succeed at COP30 in Belém. It will undoubtedly be one of the most decisive COPs of recent years, with an objective, obviously, carbon neutrality. And in my eyes, the agenda on which we must put the heart of our efforts and our investments is the exit of coal as soon as possible from all the major emerging markets. And on this, we must do it without giving lessons, with great respect. But the strategy that we have with all the major emerging markets, in particular with the agreements that we have built in recent years, the famous JET, and this is the one that has the greatest impact on the climate. If we really want to transform things, it is to accelerate China's coal peak, but to help India, Vietnam, Indonesia, and others to get out of coal as quickly as possible, to help South Africa in its transition and acceleration, etc. And so it is on this that we will focus our efforts, both diplomatic and investment. We will also have to continue to animate our One Planet summits and concrete alliance initiatives. And I believe in the strength of these alliances with all stakeholders beyond the COP30 in Belém. This will be the second axis of action. And so we will continue to have our concrete alliances with the financiers, with the industrialists, with the territories, and therefore to have a war of movement to continue chanting concrete results on this agenda. Third element, we will also continue the biodiversity agenda. France has worn it in recent years. In recent months, we have been able to build biodiversity credits that will take time to flourish. But the only thing that is resolutely effective and transformative is to have a carbon and biodiversity approach. And so this complete agenda is the one that France will also carry there in the enclosures. And finally, we will have this year in June in Nice to host the United Nations Conference on the Ocean. And it will be an extremely important meeting there for the climate, biodiversity, and the issue of the oceans. Because our oceans are a decisive carbon sink, a reserve of fundamental biodiversity, a continent of research almost to be invented, a place there to have absolutely unprecedented opportunity, a space of very strong conflictuality. And so this United Nations conference will be a decisive element. I really ask for the mobilization of the entire diplomatic network for this nice conference. And we have some goals. We will have the opportunity to come back to them in the coming months. But I just want you to have some very clear ones in mind. We're going to set up a research organization that will really be the IPCC of the oceans, and that's what we need. If we want to objectify the thing, I want us to be able to ratify the High Seas Treaty, called BBNJ. It's been one of the French successes of the last few months. This agreement had been blocked for decades, and I congratulate all those who helped to unblock it. But for it to come into force, 60 countries must ratify it. And so let's really set in motion to have these 60 ratifications in Nice. This is a truly transformative element of the regulation of the high seas. And then we must try to resume the effort that failed Busan in recent weeks on plastic. And so let's try to have an international treaty on plastic, or at least on the Mediterranean, or the enlarged Mediterranean. This is a challenge that really lives up to our ambitions. I am not exhaustive on the agenda, but these were our main objectives. This is for the climate. On health and food, we know how much it is an objective of general interest. We have advanced, reinvested in the major multilateral funds in the World Health Organization. A few weeks ago, we demonstrated our strength together in Lyon with the inauguration of the WHO Academy, which is really the anchor in terms of research training in France of the organization. But here too, we have some challenges in terms of health and nutrition. And the way of France will be important to continue first of all to defend the credits, but to defend a path which is that of free and open research in health matters. There is a very important risk today on the international agenda. It is that of the United States of America leaving the WHO, and, in a way, privatizing the debate. And we can also see it in some actors who are starting to go back on rules to blur the cards. However, we need, faced with the risk of a pandemic, to have a stronger WHO, and instead of weakening it, to learn the lessons of the pandemic that we have experienced, and to have faster crisis detection mechanisms to ensure and consolidate its independence in the face of the diplomatic pressures that it may be subjected to and to pursue its agenda. As we know, food is a twin of health. That is why next March we will have the Nutrition for Growth Summit, which will make it possible to obtain concrete results to fight against child malnutrition and pursue this agenda. And here too, I do not forget the essential nexus between climate, biodiversity, food, health with this 1L strategy that we designed at the heart of the pandemic. And we will have the opportunity to organize this year a summit in this field, which will also make it possible to remobilize all the instruments in this field in recent years at the service of this effective multilateralism. And so it will be necessary to redouble our commitment on health and nutrition at a given moment, when this agenda may be weakened by the Sino-American conflictuality and a likely American withdrawal. The third theater of battle will be that of the reform of the international financial architecture. On this, the risk that is ours is simple. It is a fragmentation of the world in which we live. Since the end of the Second World War, we have been used to a world with the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. This one has gradually lapsed. We must also be lucid here, because these rules of investment and representativeness have not taken into account the major emerging markets, and because there is a Chinese strategy to circumvent this international order. Then there is a tension that exists with this double standard that is fed by the two major Ukrainian and Near Eastern crises, and a narrative that is used by some, which consists in saying that a global South should somehow separate from this international organization that is too Western. The challenge that is ours is really to build more just, respectful, and effective rules, but to consolidate an international financial world order. We laid the foundations for this reform at the Summit for African Financing in 2021, and at the summit we held in the summer of 2023 on the new international financing. It has made it possible to build the four countries, this Paris Pact for the peoples of the planet, which has been joined by about 60 countries around the world. First of all, I want us to continue this effort so that we can join the Quater P, and then we will start the next few months with concrete initiatives. What does this pact say? In a very simple way. Firstly, we must not have to choose between the issue of developing economic opportunities and the fight against climate change and biodiversity. That is to say, no lessons to be taught, and we don't have to tell people to give up your growth for the climate in many southern countries. Secondly, the path must be chosen by each country. Gone are the big rules where everyone is dressed, if I may say so, with the same model, either in Brussels or in Washington or elsewhere. National strategy, this is what presides over our famous JETP or others. Thirdly, public concessional shocks. And so we must mobilize our common finances much better by reinvestments for the countries that can, by mutualization, and the better work of our banks. This is what we have done with joint finance, which links the mobilization of AFT and all its partners around the world, all development banks, multilateral banks, and regional banks. And through this, therefore, more also mobilize the balance sheet of the World Bank and the IMF. And fourth point, more private money, leverage. Moreover, these four rules have begun to percolate since there is a transformation underway at the IMF and at the World Bank. These are the ones that led us to propose, and then to succeed in issuing special drawing rights to the IMF, and the reallocation of more than 100 billion to the poorest countries on the African continent. We must pursue this agenda by giving more space to emerging markets, by changing governance, ambition, but the 4P agenda is more valid than ever. And so 2025 must be an agenda where we have more membership. And I ask you in each of your countries to go and look for country memberships to it, where we are carrying out transformations in accordance with the road plan, and where we are also preparing what I want to complete during the G7 that France will have organized in 2026, which is really to set up this new international order. In this regard, we will come back more precisely to these investments within the framework of the Presidential Development Council, to be held next March. And then the last point is the defense of democracy and universalism. As I was saying, a quarter of a century has passed and destroyed many illusions. A quarter of a century ago, we were told that democracy was a political construct that was only destined to expand, that it was the end of history for some, and that everything would get better and better. The awakening has been hard. It has not started this year, but I would not like us, a quarter of a century later, to be affected by the reverse syndrome. That is to say that when I hear a lot, we almost no longer dare to defend the rule of law, democracy. It would no longer be fashionable. And there is a kind of mortifying fascination for the international of reactionaries. So they are very strong, they have money, and there is a kind of reactionary acceleration indeed, to quote a recent article, that is quite well seen, but which brings together large private financial interests, and basically, which is the result of something that is true, is that our liberal democracies have not been effective enough in the face of the challenges of the middle classes. That's true. And I have been fighting for this 4 years with successes and failures. I am lucid. And we all have to keep fighting. But it is not because liberal democracy is not effective enough in the face of the migration question, in the face of the question of the economy, of its simplification, in the face of this or that question, that liberal democracies or authoritarian regimes would be more effective. And that's kind of what's happening. And this is a bit of the narrative that some would be building. All those who think that, for example, climate change is over. If we want the economy, we must simplify. We are not giving up. I told you, if we stop climate change, we will degrade our trade balance. Well, we don't produce oil and gas. It's not no for us at all, that. Those who think that the independence of judges, the independence of journalists, the independence of the academic world, is an obstacle to the effectiveness of governments, take a simple test. Who has been the most effective during the pandemics? Democracies. It was very hard, we remember that. Every day, there were people to explain to us what we needed to do. It was very tiring, I can testify. But that's it. There are scientists recognized by their peers who explain what science is. There are people who come to challenge what the government is doing. There are people who go before the judge, and sometimes they win to go back on stuff that the government does. It's called a democracy. The reality, with hindsight on pandemics, is that democracies have been more effective than authoritarian regimes. In places where science is no longer free, when we have a pandemic, it works less well. In places where there is no longer a free press, when there is a big problem, it works less well. I'm just saying this, which might seem obvious, but let's remember it everywhere and all the time. And so we must build a proactive agenda to defend democracy, universalism, the separation of power, the values of liberal democracy, and these fundamental principles, equality between women and men, the protection of political minorities, the existence of counterpower and information infrastructure. And just because sometimes we lack the effectiveness to solve problems does not mean that we have to give up our principles. On the contrary, we must be much more effective in defending these principles, because that is why we are fighting in the end. And everything I have been telling you just now would make no sense. If at the bottom, at the end, we want to resemble Russia in principle, why consider that today it is a strategic enemy? It is the great paradox of this reactionary international that fascinates so many people when I listen to our airwaves. And besides, go watch them closely on immigration, on Russia, on social networks, and what they think the same thing, not quite. Not to say that they often think the opposite. So this too will have lived soon. In this regard, That is why I ask you to have a diplomacy that continues to support the cause of women all over the world. With the Marianne Initiative that we will continue, but all the actions that are carried out by the network. Support democracy with the initiatives that we have been able to lead, for example in Africa with Professor MB. The rise of the new generation to engage for democracy with young African leaders, and that we will continue and multiply. The support for information and democracy partnership at the UN that we must continue and amplify. And we are going to pass on a European and international scale the General States of Information, which in France will give rise to a law, but which we must defend internationally. And somehow, I have good news for you. All these people, for years, have told us, there is a single thought, it's awful. A unique thought, it was the stuff of the liberal Democrats. The single thought, it has become the reactionary thought. That's good, we're going to fight. There is a huge potential. And where maybe we fell asleep thinking it was a given, we're going to wake up. But I don't want the single reactionary thought that explains to me that, in a way, renouncing the values of democracies, the preamble of our Constitution, equality between women and men, would be a good thing, a source of the future. And so, I ask the network to continue to be committed to all freedom fighters. In Georgia, with all those who fought for an election, with this brave president and her protesters, and by fighting for transparency to be made. And if the way out of the crisis must be the reorganization of an election, in order to do so, in Venezuela, where we must not look with complacency or defeatism at the date of January 10 as obvious, and where we must thereto fight alongside those who work with immense courage for pluralism and democracy, talk to them, and there to fight for free elections to be reorganized, and do so in conjunction with all our partners in the region. And we fight with all freedom fighters, professors, writers, journalists, when they are imprisoned, whatever the regime, and whatever our interests. We have always done this and we will continue to do so. And in saying this, I have a singular thought for a freedom fighter, a Franco-Algerian writer, who is Boulem Sall. He is being held in a completely arbitrary manner by Algerian officials. The Algeria that we love so much, and with which we share so many children and so many stories, enters a story that dishonors her, to prevent a seriously ill man from getting medical treatment. And it's not up to what she is. And we who love the Algerian people and their history, I urge their government to release Boulem Sall. Yes, freedom is democracy. And so, we must continue to defend them everywhere, with respect, sometimes by carrying them out when it is more effective, with force. And freedom is also the one that we will continue to defend for all our compatriots around the world, our hostages when they are detained, whatever our companies may be. And I welcome the release of those we obtained at the end of last year. And that is also why we will continue to mobilize for the release of our hostages held today in Iran, in an unworthy and unacceptable way. That's it, ladies and gentlemen, I won't be any longer. To protect the French, to ensure our prosperity, to do our duty in some way to protect ourselves from the disorders of the world. This is the line that I am giving you for the year that is opening, by reiterating to you all my best wishes. Diplomacy is only valid if it is the armor of the peoples it serves. And you will have, doing this work, to work for all our compatriots, wherever they come from, or wherever they live. And I tried there at the same time to give clear lines, to also give you the scansion of our agenda for this year. But to do it so that also many of our compatriots clearly have in mind how many daily issues are at the heart of our diplomatic action, and what you wear every day. And so I want to thank you for that, for the fight you are fighting, for your commitment, that of yours by your side, of all your teams. And also thank all the special envoys and all our partners and members of the government who, I know, are also keen to build this agenda. Long live the Republic and long live France.